On Saturday, China became the only other nation in the world to land a rover on Mars. A rover that just so happens to look strikingly similar to NASA's Spirit and Opportunity rovers, but whatever. And a lot of people online and in the space community marveled at China's achievement. Even the administrator of NASA and Elon Musk twatted their congratulations to the country's state media. Meanwhile, others find themselves hesitant to celebrate the CCP's accomplishment. After all, China is quickly proving its competency in this emerging international reenactment of the 1960s space race. And their government, an oppressive communist regime, has made it perfectly clear that they aim to be the world superpower. The head of the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program said, like the islands of the South China Seas, they wish to dominate space and plan to do so by 2045, which is pretty alarming given their authoritative reputation and the plethora of strategic resources available in space to those who can reach them. Now, inevitably there will be a few communist sympathizers, or communists themselves, who failed middle school history in the YouTube chat, that will try to divert and write that the United States isn't any better. You say chip! Freedom and liberties we Americans have is so terrible that literally millions of people every year are willing to risk their lives to sneak into our country illegally. I personally don't know any American, not even a vocal Marxist, that has moved out of our country in exchange for a socialist one, but I am aware that there are a lot of people around the world that are always looking to move here. In fact, citizens of Hong Kong waved the American flag to signal their desperate desires to be freed from the harsh laws and policies of the Chinese government.
Donald Trump, don't trust China. China is asshole.
So, socialists in the chat, as you sit there in your comfortable home, sipping on your free market Starbucks latte, expressing your First Amendment rights to hate on the First Amendment, on the American-made internet that isn't cut off from the rest of the world, like China's is, take a moment and appreciate the freedom you take for granted. And just so you're aware, the freedom to desperately seek out non-issues to politicize just so one can virtue signal by publicly bitching and moaning about how terrible one's own country is wouldn't fly in the Eastern Communist Society some seem to admire so much. And to be clear, I have no issues with the Chinese people. I see many of them as victims and wish them well in their clandestine fight for freedom, because freedom and individual liberty is what I'm all about. But rest assured, because of this talk, there will be the typical race baiters that will try to label me and call me responsible for Asian hate. You know the type, the sad saps that resort to ad hominems like, you're a racist, and empty responses like, you don't know what you're talking about, or you don't know what socialism is, without providing any actual facts of their own. And they'll do this despite the fact that I was against Asian hate before the left made it their political agenda. You know, back when the elite leftist universities were caught discriminating against Asians. So let's talk about why I personally am choosing to exercise my right to promote caution against the Chinese Communist Party's successes in space. Alright, so should the free world celebrate the Chinese government's Mars landing achievement? I know it's tempting. Progress in science, especially rocket science, is fascinating and tends to be, at least much of the time, beneficial for all. And I get the whole let's unify and explore the stars together thing. World peace is a lovely thought. Galactic peace even better, but this is a fantasy. A progressive wet dream. In reality, it would be foolish to believe that we can get there by hugging it out with our enemies, solving climate change, or providing jobs to terrorists. The hard and unfortunate truth that many in our community seem to ignore or deny is that since the beginning of written history, there has always been conflict amongst nations, in part due to conflicting cultures, differing philosophical worldviews, and there will also be those that believe their way of governing is the best way and will do anything to hang on to that power. We haven't evolved past the primitive instincts of conflict. It's human nature. Competition, natural selection, right naturalists? Survival of the fittest. Stop contradicting your own worldview. So China is one of those nations, if not the nation, that swims in murky waters. But to their credit, after returning surface samples from the moon in December, they did offer to share their findings with the world, including us, the US, but because of our nation's Wolf Amendment, we couldn't accept. The 2011 policy bans NASA from direct cooperation with the CCP. Why? Because it was done in response to the Chinese government's long history of aggressive tech theft. Of course, China knew this at the time that they mentioned the American policy in their speech to the world, so it makes you wonder, had the Wolf Amendment not been a thing, would they have still offered? Or was this just a ploy to try and embarrass their only real rival on the world stage? Of course, that's speculation, so that does leave the possibility that it was an olive branch. But with that being said, their blatant disregard for intellectual property rights isn't a secret. The entire free world knows about and perceives their tendency to pirate intellectual property as a threat. And they haven't stopped since they acquired moon rocks. Chinese scientists are constantly being arrested here in the States, working for universities to steal the latest scientific research. Chinese spy software is stealing tons of data from US companies, and when they're not doing that, their shell companies listed on the US stock exchange are busy committing securities fraud and hurting our economy while strengthening their own. They even placed a spy next to Democratic Representative Eric Swalwell. Yeah, his girlfriend was a Chinese spy. And yet, he's still a member on the subcommittee of Strategic Technologies and Advanced Research under the Committee on Intelligence. So the CCP is as dishonest as they come. Not much of a surprise considering the father of their political system is Karl Marx, a dishonest and lazy piece of shit who refused to get a real job while broke and instead mooched off his friends and dying parents. But I digress. So all this begs the question from any reasonable person who head isn't up his commie ass, how much of the tech that China put on Mars is really theirs? Next, pollution. Remember, we're painting an overall picture here of how glorious the CCP is. The environmentalists in the room will love this one. And for the record, the lawyer wife and I are pro-nuclear, okay? It's clean, it's safe, and we also recycle. And I strongly dislike litter bugs. Even a single cigarette butt thrown on the ground is poisonous to wildlife and pets. And I love animals. You may believe America's consumption of fossil fuels is disgraceful and a threat to Mother Nature, but it's not exactly something we can just switch off overnight without killing hundreds of thousands of people.
If there was a button I could press to stop all hydrocarbon usage today, I would not press it.
But as a nation, we're working on it. Some harder than others because the left is using climate change as an opportunity to push socialist programs, just like they're doing now with COVID. However, look at China, you tree huggers. They produce more CO2 emissions than the US and EU combined, and they aren't slowing down. Now some of you may be thinking, well, that's because everything is made in China. Yes, thanks to our politicians and their high taxes driving companies out of the States. But I'm glad you mentioned it. With propaganda like the vastly unpopular 1619 Project and critical race theory now being taught in our public schools, you'd think America responsible for world slavery. Even though Native Americans had slaves, the Spanish had slaves, Africans sold their own into slavery. Ironically, really the only virtuous ones on that front during the colonial times were pirates. They freed slaves and started the first republic in the Western Hemisphere. Huzzah! Slavery existed long before the days of Columbus, whose own history has been deliberately misconstrued by those on the far left who hate America. Columbus, while not perfect, actually freed Carib women from slavery, spoke highly of peaceful tribes he met like the Taínos, even made them members of the royal court, but also warred against barbaric genocidal tribes that sacrificed children and cannibalized other inhabitants, including his own men. And now the Caribbean is void of such things. Of course, on his last voyage, he was chained and sent back to Spain for mass murder, but was later absolved of the charges when it was discovered that the men who accused him were actually the ones who committed the crime, and mutinied when Columbus tried to restore order. The truth is, America willingly paid a heavy price to end slavery, called the Civil War. More than 360,000 Union soldiers died in the fight to abolish it. My own great-great-grandfather fought as a Union soldier in the Civil War just a few years after immigrating here. But while some are still adamantly pointing fingers at America's past transgressions, slavery is still a real thing on a global scale. Thanks to China's cheap labor practices, many US companies like woke Apple and woke Nike have moved their manufacturing overseas and exploited what is at its core, slavery. As many as 3.8 million Chinese victims were forced into hard labor in 2018. We're talking minimal pay, long hours, and dangerous working conditions. And the country just isn't running their racket within their own borders either. Sex and labor trafficking spreads worldwide. Their tentacles even reached a Chinese restaurant located in the small Ohio town I grew up in a few years ago, and then the Fed raided it. The CCP to this day despises freedom. They backed out of the one country, two systems agreement they had with the people of Hong Kong since '97, so the Chinese government could have a greater influence in the region, which of course meant extradition to mainland China, where citizens of Hong Kong would receive less of a fair trial, but more violence. This violation of their human rights is what stemmed the Hong Kong protests. And we already hinted at Christian persecution under their atheistic system of government, but their Uyghur population, mostly Muslim, is also being rounded up and sent to concentration camps. I'm sorry, re-education camps. And of course, when COVID broke out, they both surveilled and disappeared whistleblowers. And yeah, this video would not be complete if we didn't mention COVID, China's biggest contribution to the world as of late. Last year, when I still had a Twitter account, I shared a paper written by a whistleblower, and an actual scientist who worked at the Wuhan lab, writing that the virus came from the lab, not the wet market. And now I studied microbiology at a graduate level and I taught it in the classroom, but I'm not a microbiologist, okay? And I certainly don't work in Wuhan. But I thought it was worth reading and considering a possibility. I mean, what are the odds that a virus the lab was working on came from a nearby bat restaurant and not the lab itself? Again,
You say trip.
But from all the woke tongue lashing I got on Twitter in response to my public pondering about this article, you'd think everyone on the platform was at the wet market and saw the Chinese dude eat the damn thing themselves, because they didn't appreciate my questioning the narrative. And I gotta say, for a bunch of internet scientists, they're pretty close-minded and definitely don't like having their hypotheses challenged. I mean, what respected scientist does? Well, guess what, you blind twatter sheep? Now the evidence is starting to show that the virus probably did come from the Wuhan lab. And so the conspiracy theory becomes an actual conspiracy. Don't worry, I don't need an apology. I'll settle for a meh. And so now those of you who were called anti-science conspiracy theorist bigots by the woke mob seem to be on the correct side of history the more time passes. And now some of those open-minded people are contemplating whether or not this leak was intentional. I'm not saying it was, but I implore those of you who love to twat your feelings to just be open-minded to the possibility and not leave more room for future embarrassment due to your arrogance. I tell you, man, if Twitter was a chat room for detectives, we'd all be screwed. Oh, and by the way, the Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, of which our #1 COVID task force guy, Dr. Fauci, is the director, was recently exposed as a funder for the Wuhan lab's gain-of-function research. Of course, Fauci tries to deny it, his excuse being the money went through an intermediary first. But you can't make this stuff up, man. And of course, you can't trust big media either to tell you this. Many of them are also in China's pocket. But why even bother considering this ludicrous idea that China could have leaked the virus on purpose? Well, let's just take a look at history. I know the far left doesn't like history, okay? Which is why they try their best to change it. But there is a book by historian William McNeill called Plagues and Peoples. The Antonine Plague from 165 to 180 AD weakened Roman legions, and in combination with the Plague of Cyprian, was enough to fracture their ability to defend themselves, and were so ultimately defeated by barbarians from the north. China's own Han Dynasty was taken down in part by an epidemic. The Mongols brought the Black Death from Asia to Europe and wiped out a third of the European population. And these diseases the Europeans got from Asia, like malaria and smallpox, were then brought to the American Indians when the New World was discovered, causing more devastation than any unforgivable evil that you mistakenly thought Christopher Columbus committed. So all that's to say is that there is a long history of plagues being extremely useful at shifting the axis of power on a global scale. And we already established China doesn't care about its own people. The government sees them as expendable. What communist country doesn't? Over 100 million dead in less than 100 years? Yeah, excellent work. I blame this worthless piece of shit. But again, to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying this is the reality of the situation or necessarily the case. We just don't have enough information. We don't even know for sure that COVID did come from the lab, because China has stymied investigations into the origins of the Wuhan virus by both blocking investigators into the lab and withholding pertinent data. Now think about this logically for 1 second. Why would they do that? Well, I think there's really only two plausible explanations. Either they accidentally leaked the virus, or they deliberately leaked the virus. Right now, I'm in the former camp, but I'm remaining open to the latter explanation. Before the pandemic, China was becoming a real threat to the Western free world, but now they're much more empowered. Trump put them in their place with tariffs and came down hard on their spies and never moved an inch every time they tried to flex their military prowess. And the American economy boomed. and reached record highs. Not a good thing for our enemies. And then it just so happens during his re-election year, COVID reaches the States. China tried to cover it up at first and didn't tell the rest of the world, and when it did come out, it was already too late. Amidst all the confusion, Trump made the right call and shut down incoming travel from infected regions, and in turn was called a racist by Biden and the left, who at the same time argued for open borders, they still do, but still blamed Trump once the virus arrived stateside anyway. The nerve. And now, despite the many successes of his presidency, Trump's out of office. China is more of a world superpower now than ever before, and Joe Biden, whose son is still collecting paychecks from the Chinese, is sitting in the Oval Office. And now he's trying to take away the intellectual property rights of COVID vaccine manufacturers and hand them to other countries like China. Why? Well, because his administration is the most progressive our nation has ever had at the helm. Even more so than Woodrow Wilson. They're pushing for a socialist society, in case you weren't aware. You know, the Great Reset. I mean, you've heard the slogans, right? Build back better, you'll own nothing and be happy. It's all about government control. More specifically, world government control, which is probably why Biden's first act of office was to shut down the Keystone Pipeline and put thousands of Americans out of jobs. And yet he just lifted sanctions that prevented Russia from tapping into a European pipeline, right after Russian hackers hacked our colonial pipeline. And it turns out we didn't pay a $5 million ransom for that. It was a $90 million ransom to Russian terrorists. China, of course, is cool with the decision of this president to violate patent rights on vaccines because now they won't have to steal them. China wants access to these patents because their vaccines suck, frankly. They're less than 50% effective against the virus and can even make you go blind if it doesn't kill you. And now they're resorting to creating a cocktail of doses to give to recipients. That doesn't sound dangerous at all. See, this is what happens in a truly socialist society. The first thing that has to happen is the taking away of property rights. And that de-incentivizes people to work and invent, which is exactly what we're seeing right now when Americans stay home and not go to work thanks to government handouts. You want to talk about slavery? Socialism makes you a slave to the government. So, should we really be celebrating the Chinese Communist Party's accomplishments in space just for the sake of science and the ambition to unite the world? Knowing that if China were to obtain valuable ground and resources in space, it would certainly make them the world leader? That's the call you're going to have to make yourself. But as a science teacher, I ask that you keep just one thing in the back of your mind. Science isn't always wielded for the benefit of all humanity. See you next week.